Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket possess a unique environment where history, natural beauty, and local character come together in marvelous ways. There are many ways to discover the Cape and Islands. Some of these ways are paved and direct. Others are rough, rustic. And there are the less visible ways, like the ways of the residents, which are a singular mixture of old and new. A remarkable sense of continuity and established patterns of life weave residents and visitors alike into a rich field of uniquely American stories. Here is where the Pilgrims first landed in the New World, and where they built the first towns of the English colonies. Later came the home ports of the great merchant fleets, and in our own time, the resorts of presidents. The old town greens and antique houses provide a glimpse of this history, but many regions have preserved homes and historic markers. On the Cape and Islands, there is something more. There is the sense that as you move through the region, you're wading in one of the great rivers of American history. The stories here grow out of a continuous tradition of shared experience and honest labor. This heritage provides all of us such American stereotypes as the old salt and the frugal Yankee. Here, there is a sense of an unbroken thread of life and common experience, tied directly to our country's earliest moments. They transcend the formal divisions that usually separate history from memory. The tales of the Cape and Islands continue to resound in our sense of place, our traditions of work and play, and our images of beauty. All this history and tradition does not provide immunity from the ravages of today's culture and economy. In summer, this continues to be one of the liveliest places in the country. There are the bustling resort towns with the crowds on the streets. The traffic jams are legendary. And there's the constant rush of visitors, each looking for their perfect moment of vacation magic. Yet within this rush of activity sit the quiet small towns with their architectural preservation. And there's a more organic preservation, carried on unselfconsciously by people who follow the ways of their ancestors. They are still fishermen, and they keep farming the land. They continue as artists, innkeepers, and writers, keeping traditions alive simply by making their living. The Cape and Islands have been through good times and bad. These cycles have spawned a distinctive Yankee personality. The locals possess a unique, some might say flinty, character. It was forged by the demands of the land, the whims of the sea, the rigors of the Puritan morality, and the harsh New England climate. Sometimes visitors miss this unique part of the Cape and Islands because in the last 50 years, so many new folks have been washed ashore to become permanent residents that it's increasingly hard to find people who still embody the spirit of those who tended the land before the tourist tidal wave. And yet, their presence ensures that all residents, both old and new, find themselves woven into the region's unique stories. One person who can talk with authority about earlier times is bus tour guide Ruth Rusher of Hyannis.
You're standing right in the house of my parents. I was born in the same village, on the same street, in the same house, in the same bed, and in the same room that my mother was, maybe a couple of weeks before me. Well, all of Cape Cod is favorite to me, having been born and reared and enjoyed it as it was. I enjoy going down to the Bass Hole. I like to look across the marsh. I like to look out into the ocean. I like to be on the water. I like to sail. The real character is a rural, slant, relaxed people and a slow pace instead of a rush and hurry, and lots of open space and lots of appreciation for nature.
For all their summer beauties, the Cape and Islands have a harsh environment, which extracts its cost in the winter and spring. Waiting for the tourists to return, the winter storms to fade, the crops to come, and the fleets to return, the area developed a natural conservatism.
I'll show you what the logo looks like for most Cape Coders. Here it is. There you are. The logo. Notice the grip. There it is. That's what makes a Cape Codder. Wear it out. Use it up. Make it do, or you don't need it.
This Yankee character is almost one of the attractions of the region. It's certainly the reason that many parts of the area have been able to preserve their colonial charms. And it's the secret for understanding the towns and their history.
Well, just the character of a Cape Cod is kind of different. Live and let live, and if a person isn't being hurt, you just let them get into a hole. And they'll learn after a while.
The natural conservatism has also led to a certain provincialness. Locals think in terms that divide the lower Cape from the upper Cape. The islands are separate from the mainland. In fact, most longtime residents will be aghast at the presumption of telling a common story of the Cape and Islands. But in truth, they're more alike than different. They share common ways, the ways of the sea, the traditions of the land, the religious heritage and common ancestry. They share the unpredictable weather and the harshness of the New England landscape. In fact, when man first came here, they were connected.
Man came to Martha's Vineyard 10,000 years ago, and he had a very easy time getting here because he didn't have to contend with a ferry boat or a canoe because the island was not yet an island. It was a high point on a coastal plain, and the glaciers had to melt for 5,000 years after that before you filled in the oceans around us and turned us into an island. We're also told in another 5,000 years the island will erode and be a sandbar, so we urge you to enjoy it while you're here and reconsider waterfront property.
At their roots, the Cape and Islands share many threads of common heritage and an overwhelming sense of continuity.
I see it being like old-fashioned way of doing things, not like the city way where everything's moving, going this way, going that way. We're just kind of going with the flow, I guess you could say, you know, just to get the job done.
The region's stories are divided into some major themes. There is the uniqueness of the glacier-formed spit of land. There's the history, art, and architecture to be found in the antique towns. There's the industry of the sea and the land, and the nurture of the tourists. And there is the beauty, to be discovered by yourself or through the eyes of the local artists. To discover the Cape and Islands, look at all their ways, the roads, the customs, the traditions and peculiarities of the towns and the people. Each provides its own piece of the larger story that is part of the common heritage of all America. Out of the everydayness of work and sacrifice, exploration and preservation, we can see all ourselves reflected in the unique ways of these tiny pieces of land thrust out in the Atlantic Ocean. These are the ways of the Cape and Islands that make this one of the most popular sites to discover in all America. Although it is the sea that seems to draw everyone to the region, it's the land that makes the Cape and Islands. And the land itself has its own stories and traditions. The The character of the region arises from the unique landscape, or more precisely, seascape. For nowhere on the Cape and Islands are you ever more than 10 miles from open water. The land is defined by the sea, but separate from it. As Thoreau said, it is the
bed and bended arm of Massachusetts. The shoulder is Buzzard's Bay, the elbow or crazy bone at Cape Malabar, the wrist at Truro, and the sandy fist at Provincetown, behind which the state stands on her guard, with her back to the green mountains and her feet planted on the floor of the ocean.
This narrow peninsula and attendant islands possess a unique landscape that requires special understanding. It's an area so rich in lore and beauty and unique geology that they created a national park out of a good chunk of it. That's the Cape Cod National Seashore.
Cape Cod's outer beach is known throughout America. Immediately behind that outer beach is the feature geologists know best, and that's the coastal bank. And in contrast with other places where behind the shore there's a wind-blown accumulation of dune sand, here the coastal bank, the land behind the sea, is an entirely different kind of geological feature. This is land built by the glaciers. From a natural standpoint, the Cape is really a very new place. It dates back only to the end of the final ice age. But as the ice moved down, it brought with it the pulverized rock of northern and central New England, and that's been deposited here as the glacial sands of Cape Cod. And of course, since the glacier retreated, sea level has been rising, and the sands of the Cape have been regraded by the ocean, and the Cape has been sculpted to the familiar shape of an uplifted arm that we all know so well on the map of the United States today. That's among the first things that people notice. And another thing that people notice early on is the natural whirl of the Cape. The marshes are among the most special places on the Cape. We have an abundance of wetlands, both freshwater wetlands and saltwater wetlands. Perhaps the best landmark, the best known among the saltwater marshes is Nauset Marsh in Easttown. It's one of the largest marsh systems anywhere on Cape Cod. One of the things that fascinates me is the fact that this is where the marine food chain begins. This is really where the whole ocean begins to feed itself, because this is where the fish come to spawn, and this is the nursery for many of the species of shellfish that Cape Cod's so justly famous for. And then, of course, there's the vegetation itself, the salt marsh grasses that are so productive and so lush and provide so much color, both in the summer with their greenness and in the fall of the year as they begin to change. And then as we move inland, we find the dunes, which have been sculpted by the wind into some fascinating shapes, and some of them are bare, some are covered with vegetation, some are marching across forests. And the forests of the Cape come in a greater diversity and variety than a lot of people would think, because of course the classic Cape Cod tree is the pitch pine. There are oaks of several types, and here and there in the wetlands, in the bottoms of glacial hollows, you find red maple swamps, Atlantic white cedar swamps, and in a couple of those, the National Park Service has developed boardwalk trails that are especially inviting spots. They're good places to go to seek the solitude away from the crowds.
The tidal flats and estuaries have long provided easy access to the sea's bounties of fish and shellfish. For that reason, people have been residing on the Cape and Islands for thousands of years. Long before the coming of the Europeans, there were the Wampanoags. Their name meant the people of the dawn, and it was their role among the tribal nations to greet the rising sun. At first, the Wampanoag coexisted in a respectful distance from the early Pilgrims. But they showed the colonists how to plant corn and squash, and the general skills that literally saved the colonists' lives. But the Wampanoags were not Christians, and because of that were regularly hunted down and abused. But these early friends of the colonists left their own legacy.
Hyannis got its name from the Indian Iano, who was friendly to them and taught them how to cook and use the shellfish that were available. And as we went along, the Americans kind of lazy in speech, and they decided that they would call it Hyannis, which is far easier to say.
When the Pilgrims first arrived in 1620, their first landfall was in what is now Provincetown Harbor. They had a long way to shore in the mud, and many got sick. But their stopover is memorialized by this epic tower.
We're here at the Pilgrim Monument in Provincetown Museum. The monument was built to first commemorate the landfall of the Pilgrims here in Provincetown. This was their first landing. And also the signing of the Mayflower Compact in our harbor, which is the most important modern document relating to government and democracy as we know it today. It was the first time a group of citizens banded together to form their own rules and governance. There was no longer the need for a king, and it was a representational type government because they simply did not want any one person to become too powerful in the colony. So that's where they came forth, like with our selectman form of government as we know it in New England today.
Unfortunately, Provincetown did not have a ready supply of fresh water. Some explorers set off on a boat to survey the rest of the land. They almost settled in Eastham, where the party spent the night on the beach. But the next morning, they were surprised by an encounter with a Wampanoag hunting party. A brief skirmish ensued, and each side fled. But from this event, First Encounter Beach in Eastham got its name. Soon, the Mayflower sailed across Massachusetts Bay to Plymouth, where they reportedly stepped ashore here on Plymouth Rock. Life in that early colony was harsh. Yet these earliest moments in the American experience hold such a fascination that a major attraction is now the recreated colony at Plymouth Plantation. Using extensive research, this living museum allows visitors to see what the early settlement must have been like about 7 years after its founding. Here, the resident interpreters provide stories of both the external and internal life of the early colony.
You see, I cannot speak so openly about this here in the middle of the street, for some of my neighbors might hear me. For we did not come here for the purpose of religion. Yeah, for that is more so my neighbors. Yeah, for they have separated from the King's Church. Yeah, for that is the lawful church, and that is why they had to flee to Holland. Well, in order to attain land, my father had decided to come here so that we prosper and all that. Well, father, you were that of a weaver back in London, and that is a poor man's trade. And it was very difficult for father to provide enough coin for we, even to bring home that of a loaf of bread.
After several years at Plymouth, the colony was floundering, and the early settlers realized they'd not chosen the best land or harbor for a prosperous settlement. So a delegation of elders was sent out to survey Eastham and decide whether the whole colony should be moved out there. The party came back to report that this idea would probably be inadvisable. However, those same elders promptly turned around and returned to settle themselves in Eastham. Sharing the commonwealth was not a strong part of the Cape character even then. As their settlements began to expand down the Cape and out into the islands, each of the villages grew into some of the oldest towns in North America. Each one developed their own character and traditions, which can still be found in the stories that flow down through the generations. The best way to discover the feel of this Cape history is to explore along Old Route 6A.
6A, of course, is protected, and it's protected with the Historic Commission Act that keeps it 500 feet inside on either side of the road, you must get a permit to change your real estate in any way whatsoever.
Along 6A, there is the history and architecture of the Cape in wonderful profusion. The most common piece of architecture is the Cape Cod house.
Well, certainly one of the things that catches people's interest and catches their eye almost at once is the wealth of historic architecture that exists on the Cape. Of course, the Cape Cod style house is a contribution to American culture nationwide. It's been emulated all over the country, and in fact, probably by now over a good part of the world. But this is where that house type originated, and it's a fascinating story of a design, a style of English country cottage brought to the United States, brought to the New World, and reinterpreted in the materials that were available here.
Cape Cod houses, when a young man was about to be married, he'd build his intended a half Cape Cod house. Now this house would face south because the summer sun is cooler, the winter sun is warmer. And you'd start with a living room, dining room. Behind that, a kitchen where the center of activity took place. And if it was a long, hard, cool, damp winter, by spring you'd need to build on to your house. So then you'd go back to the front of the house where there were 2 windows, a door, and you put another room on, so they give you another window. That would be considered to be 3/4 of a house. And then you'd go on, maybe you needed some more room, so you put another room on. Now you've got a full house, 2 windows on either side of the door. And then that house would be low to the ground, because if it were low to the ground, it would certainly shed the elements. And that's the story of a Cape Cod house.
Most people see the Cape houses, but since the style is so common, it's not remarkable. However, everyone who drives the back roads of the Cape discovers the charms of the American sea captains' houses. These date back to the days of the great mercantile expansion of New England. This was the time of the clipper ships and the China trade. Some of the finest houses are found in the bayside towns of Brewster and Yarmouth.
2-story colonials are the captains' houses, and they went to sea, and when they came back they had furniture, knickknacks, and this sort of thing, and a little more of the green, in quotes, money. And so they built themselves a house that they thought was a bit more gracious, and they could get the things they had brought back from the 7 seas in the house without crowding the family out.
While the Cape sports fine old homes, it's really out at the great whaling ports of Nantucket and Edgartown where you find some of the grandest sea captains' houses in the country.
Naturally, the result of this great industrial activity here on Nantucket Island was the accumulation of some rather serious wealth by a lot of the ship owners and the merchants and manufacturers and so on. And they built some magnificent homes up along what we know as the court end of Main Street. Interestingly enough, all those magnificent homes are located about as far away as you can conveniently get by walking from the waterfront, because the closer you got to the waterfront, the worse it smelled.
As the land developed into towns, one of the things that people created along with their houses was stuff. There was furniture and tools and decorations. And once that stuff gets old enough, it becomes antiques. Now, antique dealing is one of the oldest industries on Cape Cod. Although there is a heavy dose of antique shops in every Cape and Islands town, the mother lode of these shops is found along Route 6A in Brewster.
It's just a nice life here on 6A in Brewster. Sometimes I call it Miracle Mile. It just feels right that people choose this stretch of road to open an antique shop. It's real nice. There's enough traffic in the summer to make it interesting. I'm an artist who happens to love folk art, and the part of folk art that I love the best is a process called pachamani, which means patch of many. So I was always on the hunt for odd pieces of furniture and then odd pieces of junk. And then I had a huge problem of what am I going to do with all of my stuff. So I thought, how wonderful, I'll open up a little antique collectible junk shop during the summer on Cape Cod. What could be more perfect? I mean, it's the Cape. It's a beautiful place. It's interesting. I mean, each season is different. In the winter, it's nice and quiet. We all look forward to it, and just about the time that we can't stand one more moment of winter, it begins to be spring. And if it doesn't rain constantly, you know, we eventually open our shops or go to our work or do whatever it is we do in the spring and the summer to earn a living. And you meet lots of wonderful people. It's just terrific. And then by the time you've just said, if I see one more person, I'm just going to scream, it's fall and winter again. So you get your break. It's just wonderful.
To really know the Cape and Islands, start with the sea. Once, the skippers from these shores made their way around the world's oceans. And today, many still follow the ways of the sea. It's an ever-present force in the lives of all the residents. When the writer and naturalist Henry David Thoreau made his famous walk upon the Outer Cape in the 1850s, he reported,
I went to see the ocean, and that's possibly the best place on the coast to go to. I do not know where there is another beach in the Atlantic states attached to the mainland so long and at the same time so straight, and a bank which at the same time shows you the land and the sea, and part of the time two seas. Here is the waterfall of waterfalls. A storm in the fall or winter is the time to visit it, a lighthouse or a fisherman's hut, the true hotel. A man may stand there and put all America behind him.
the sea is the blood of the Cape and Islands. After all, Cape Cod was named for a fish. The offshore banks created some of the world's most fertile fishing grounds, which drew European fishermen long before the first colonies were established. Early mariners proclaimed that around this cape the codfish were so thick that one might walk upon their backs. Following the tales of the fishermen came the adventurers and explorers. These explorers had the habit of naming everything.
The first Englishman to come here was a man named Bartholomew Gosnell. Gosnell was looking for the Northwest Passage and gold, and he spent 6 hours on the vineyard and left, which makes him a typical summer visitor. What makes Gosnell memorable, aside from being first, is that he probably can be blamed for the name Martha's Vineyard. He complains in his log that he tripped over wild grapevines, which would give you vineyard, and his mother-in-law was named Martha.
The survival of the early colony was tied to the sea, specifically to fishing. Dried fish was the tribute sent back to England and the cornerstone of intercolony trade. In fact, because their farms were so poor, in 1626 the Pilgrims built a trading post in Bourne at Apatuxet to exchange dried fish for grain grown down in the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. As time went on, almost all the families of the Cape and Islands fished at least part of the time. Eventually, most of the towns harbored extensive fishing fleets. The sea is so much in the blood of the Cape and Islands that even towns with poor harbors provided whole families of sea captains. These were the old salts, the crusty retired captains with their tales of days before the mast, storms out on the banks and racing around the Horn. The character of today's Cape Cod is still defined by this sailing history, and the towns still compete with each other in traditions that date back hundreds of years.
go back to the days of the clipper ships, go back to the days when most every man left Cape Cod on a boat to go to the 7 seas, and realize that each of the towns on Cape Cod are competitive with each other. That came in way back when, let's say, a captain and his boat was over to India, and he looked up and in the distance saw another boat. The first thing he did was tighten his lines, and the race began to see who was going to get into Bombay first. When he came home, the same type of person prevailed, and he simply was competitive with the people in the next town to him. He wanted to be a little better than they were.
The grand sailing ship is still a dramatic sight along the shore. In the 18th and 19th centuries, great merchant trading fleets set up the China trade and the slave trade, while other great fleets were out hunting for whale oil. This industry produced much of the wealth of the region. The whale fishing provided legends and literature that still echo in the region. Naturally, both Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard claim the discovery of whaling. Both islands share the presence of great schools of whales just offshore. Surprisingly, the development of the whaling industry can be credited to the survival of the native populations of the island.
Of course, what changes us on the Vineyard is the coming of whaling. And once you convert a Wampanoag Indian to Christianity, you can no longer justify killing him off as a heathen. And the Wampanoags survived on Martha's Vineyard until the present century, and that meant they were in place to teach us how to be whalers, because they had whaled for centuries before the white man ever came here. So it's on the Vineyard that people already have whale oil when the need for something like whale oil becomes apparent, and they've got maybe a 10-year start on everybody else. And by the time anyone else catches on, we're already well into production. We start out whaling casually off the beaches. By 1810, we're already searching all over the Atlantic. By 1820, we run out of whales in the Atlantic and we're on our way to the Pacific.
While Edgartown was a great whaling port, most people associate whaling with Nantucket. The Nantucket Whaling Museum is a good place to discover this history.
It's just incredible when you stop and think that a little tiny island like this had such a tremendous influence over the entire world, partly because of the seamanship, the maritime exploits of Nantucket whalers and ship captains, but also because of the tremendous commerce and trade that was based upon the products of the whale fishery, as it was called then. Nantucket was the Houston of its day. It was a real oil town, and was probably the major oil refinery area in the entire world, and the products that came from the refining and manufacturing processes that were developed and perfected here on this island, right along with the whale fishery, were used throughout the world. Whale oil and spermaceti candles were used primarily for lighting the homes and buildings of the world. There were as many uses for the products of the whale fishery then as there are for the products of the petroleum industry today. And they gradually developed a whole brand new kind of vessel called the whaler, or the whale ship, which is not one of these glamorous greyhounds of the sea or beautiful tall ship. She's a tubby little tanker, that's all she is. And they were real stinkers too. I mean, you could smell these ships for miles away if the wind was in the right direction. So there was nothing glamorous or handsome or beautiful about the whale ship, nor was the life of the people aboard them. When a whale was spotted by the lookouts who stood on the cross trees of the mainmast, they'd take off after the whale, and when they were able to fasten a harpoon into the body of the whale being frightened and angered and hurt would take off. Now, your big sperm whales can make good 20 or 22 knots. So one of these little whale boats here, 30 to 33 feet in length for the most part, with a crew of 6 aboard, it would all of a sudden go zooming across the surface of the sea at close to 30 miles an hour. That was called the Nantucket Sleigh Ride.
The sea still provides for the Cape and Islands, and fishing continues to be a local industry, although often as not it's sports fishing. Yet several towns still retain their commercial fleets. In Provincetown, the fishing history is everywhere, and the harbor is still a fishing port. The fishermen here are Portuguese. They came here generations ago, and their presence is everywhere. Falmouth not only retains a fleet, but at the southern tip of the Cape at Woods Hole, the Oceanographic Institute is one of the world's leading resources for our continuing understanding of the ways of the sea. The outermost fishing town on the Cape is found at the unlikely port of Chatham. Its fish pier is a well-known attraction, and because of the shifting shoals and currents at the entrance of its harbor, it's one of the most treacherous anywhere. But John Orr still fishes out of Chatham.
I got into it when I was 5 years old. My father used to be a lobsterman at the time, and I went with him whenever I could, whenever my mother would let me go at the age of 5, which was not often enough back then. And I just grew up through it through the years. It's something I've always done. I never saw anything else I wanted to do, and I don't think I will do anything else. Chatham's traditional history was the long lining, which is many baited hooks in a tub trawl, they call it back then, which they'd steam out in the morning, set them on the bottom, retrieve them, which takes anywhere from 3 to 5 hours. And that was pretty much the bread and butter for catching codfish around here until the gill nets came along. The old times are gone. I mean, there's only a couple left that could tell you stories now, but the majority of them, when I was a kid growing up, they used to tell you about. A lot of them that used to fish out of here used to fish on the schooners that would go on the dories out on George's Bank. And there was a lot of those guys here when I was growing up, but they've all passed away now. Well, the reason everybody wants to fish out of Chatham is because we're the closest port to sea than any port around. I mean, we're 30 miles at sea before anybody leaves the dock, because we're 30 miles east of Boston, and we're closer to the grounds than anybody. You know, the more productive fishing grounds. Gill netting is where you set a net which stands perpendicular straight up and down off the ocean floor, and the mesh determines the size of the fish you're going to catch. You leave the nets out overnight. They fish best during the night. The fish have a tendency to sort of see them during the day, and then we leave in the morning, anywhere from 3 in the morning till 5 in the morning, and we steam roughly anywhere from 8 miles to 40 miles, depending on where the fish are this time of the year. And we retrieve them, haul them back, and pick the fish out. The gill net hauler we use is what they call a 24-inch Crosley hauler. The fish come around the machine and the crew will pick them out, myself, and then we push the net back to one man in the box who will flake the nets. We'll spread the float line from the lead line, because the lead line is what holds one end of the net to the bottom, and the float line holds the other net up in the air. There was hard times. My father saw it. You'd work for nothing. I mean, the price of fish wasn't worth much, and you put in, you know, you go out and catch 10,000 pounds and they get 11 to 12 cents, or get a nickel. Because it was supply and demand. There was more supply than there was demand. I know a lot of guys in this town right now that are almost right around between 60 and 70 years of age, and they're still going. They don't want to give it up. I have no idea why.
The sea that has given so much to the Cape and Islands has also taken much away. The shoals and currents off the Cape and Islands are some of the most dangerous sailing grounds in the world.
There were dozens of storms each winter on the Outer Cape, and any one of them might drive one or even several vessels ashore. In 1841, in a single gale, 57 men and boys from Truro were lost in a single storm. And finally, in 1872, coastal members of Congress persuaded the entire body to establish a system of life-saving stations that would not only be equipped by the federal government, but would be staffed with personnel who were on the federal payroll. And the first of those stations, a group of 9 that extended from Race Point to Monomoy Island here on the Outer Cape, went into service. This system of stations scattered about every 5 miles, the length of the outer beach on Cape Cod, provided shore patrols that watched for stranded vessels on the sandbars of the wintertime Cape, and provided crews that went to the aid of mariners in peril. Each station had a keeper who was the officer in charge, and a crew of 8 or 9 surfmen, as they were known, who would haul the cart carrying a large pulling boat out to the scene of a wreck. Probably no greater icon of maritime history here in southern New England can be found than the lighthouses of Cape Cod. These classic towers standing high above the water, high above the surf, with their steady signal, warning mariners on their way home, beckoning them home with the welcome light and fog signal. Perhaps the most symbolic and best known is Highland Light, or Cape Cod Light, in Truro. It's located on a height of land 120 feet above the Atlantic, and its steady beacon, visible 20 miles out at sea, is the first light that a ship inbound to Boston Harbor from a crossing of the North Atlantic will see. Yeah, in addition to Cape Cod Light, there are a number of other lighthouses on outer Cape Cod. 3 of them define the extremity of the Provincetown Hook, Race Point, Wood End, and Long Point, to guide vessels into Provincetown Harbor. Further south in Eastham is Nauset Light, with its distinctive red and white pattern to the tower and its red and white lamps displayed out to sea at night. And inland, its predecessors, the Three Sisters of Nauset, 3 separate lighthouses stretched out over a distance of about 100 yards. This was a way of distinguishing this light station from others to the north and south, specifically to distinguish the Nauset Light Station from Highland Light to the north and Chatham Light to the south. Chatham Lighthouse is just outside Cape Cod National Seashore within the town of Chatham.
The lighthouses on the Outer Cape are only part of the region's collection. In Falmouth, Nobska Light is one of the most memorable. And out on the islands, Gay Head Light towers over the cliffs. And there are West Chop Light and East Chop Light, guiding ships to Vineyard Haven. And the tower at Edgartown is one of the region's most memorable. Sankaty Head Light out in Nantucket is every bit as dramatic as Cape Cod Light. And the diminutive Brant Point Light at the entrance to Nantucket Harbor has the distinction of being the 2nd oldest lighthouse in the whole country. The dangers of the sea off the outer shore led to more than lighthouses and coast guards. They led to the construction of the Cape Cod Canal, one of the major public works of Massachusetts history. Back in Pilgrim days, the idea of a canal through the Cape led to an early construction of a ditch across the Cape at Orleans, going from Nauset Marsh to Boat Meadow. It didn't work as planned. It silted up and the idea was abandoned until late in the 19th century. Then various visionaries started to build a new canal through Sandwich and Bourne. After various failures, this grand project was completed as a toll canal in 1914. Dogged perseverance and the ever-present danger of the Outer Cape had finally paid off. After 300 years of scheming and planning, coastal shipping is now protected from the outer shoals by the Cape Cod Canal. For all its whims and dangers, the sea remains the central feature of the region. And truth to tell, most residents still earn their living, either directly or indirectly, from the sea. if you include tourism in the job mix. It's the magnet that draws every visitor to the Cape and Islands. Today, selling the experience of the sea is the area's major industry. For those who want to get out on the water, there's the pleasure cruise in Hyannis Harbor. Or for an island destination, there are the ferries. While commercial fishing remains, most of today's fishermen cast in the surf or go out in one of the charter boats. And whaling, of sorts, is once again a major industry. Since becoming a protected species, the leviathans have returned to the local waters. Of course, today's whaling fleets don't stink and only bring back memories. The waters off the Cape are one of the best places in the world to come and view these gentle giants. But for most of us, the enchantment of the sea is found at the beach. Sometimes it seems that everyone in the Northeast flocks to the Cape to revel in the long afternoons on the warm sands, listening to the soothing roar of the surf. You can find 30 miles of beach in the national seashore alone, culminating at the dune-surrounded desert at Race Point. For a quiet afternoon at the water, the bayside beaches provide a slower pace. And the bayside is where you find the sunsets, like the famous show at Rock Harbor. Out on the islands, there are seemingly endless beaches, like the dramatic Strand below Gay Head on Martha's Vineyard. And the island sunsets are always memorable. Everything changes. Where once the sea promised the Cape and Islands riches from its harvest, today the commercial value of the sea has changed from its harvest to its setting. And as long as this magic exists, the sea will continue to nurture the life of Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket. The wealth of the region came from the sea, but ultimately its survival depended on the land. The local farms were the keystone of Cape life, and their heritage created much of today's ambience. The best farmland was found in Eastham, just beyond Brewster and Orleans on the Lower Cape. And why was it the Lower Cape? Because in earlier times, as you went out Cape Cod, you went down the Cape.
The thing that you should remember, however, Eastham has the best agricultural soil of any place on Cape Cod, and they used to raise white turnips and prize asparagus and send the asparagus daily to the Boston market and to the New York market by train. And in Eastham is the oldest windmill on Cape Cod.
When the first settlers came here, the land was very rich. And nobody had plowed it or farmed it extensively, so the settlers who came here found a rich place to grow corn. It was known for years as the breadbasket of Plymouth because they could produce enough grain to export. It also meant the byproduct of silage from the corn crop, that they had a lot of cattle here. The Seufert family started their meat business in this part of the world. The reason for the windmills was because of a lack of water power. In places where there was no usable water power, people went to windmills instead. And along along the seacoast was one of the most common places to find them. Among the first people to come here were, not the very first crowd, but among the earliest settlers were some millwrights. Well, this mill was built somewhere around 1680 in Plymouth. It's the only windmill still standing on a working site on Cape Cod. Grain goes in here in the hopper, and then it goes into a chute here and goes down into a hole in the middle of the stone called the eye of the stone. As the stone rotates, the wind makes the stone go around. It turns in a counterclockwise manner. The grain is caught between ground up, and the centrifugal force of the stone pushes it out to the outer edges of the stone, and as it collects there, the edge of the stone sweeps it around and drives it out a hole in the front.
And you know about 3 sheets for the wind, don't you? Well, you see, they put a sail, a piece of canvas, on each of those arms. So they put 2 on, and the wheel would spin fairly good. And then they go ahead and put a 3rd one on, and the thing would go rickety. And so that's why you get 3 sheets to the wind. And you know about keeping your nose to the grindstone? There's a little slot, and the ground goes down by there. So every once in a while, the miller would go and put his nose to that slot, and if he smelt the grain was burning, he'd put brakes on the windmill, and it couldn't turn quite so fast.
The islands were once mostly farms as well. Because of the moor-like landscape of the islands, they were particularly well suited to sheep farming. In the early days, that was their main export besides whale oil. Today, if anyone were to think of agriculture on the Cape and Islands, it would be because of the cranberry. The cranberry bog has been a feature of the Cape going back to colonial times. They occurred naturally here in the sandy, marshy lowlands. The berry used to be a folk medicine for colds and for general health. In the early 1800s, a Henry Hall of Dennis discovered a method of productively growing the cranberries for commercial farming. Everyone used to turn out for the yearly harvest. Since then, the tiny bush has been the staple of the Cape economy.
Cranberries is definitely old Cape Cod. Fishing is old Cape Cod. This particular bog is 100 years old. You know, cranberry farming goes back generations and generations and generations. I mean, we talk to still a lot of the old timers today that are out and around that can tell you a lot of things about what's going on with cranberries and what they did years ago compared to what we do today. You know, today's totally different with mechanical equipment and things compared to years ago when it was all hand labor. They created the bogs. All these bogs were created by hand. This particular bog we do in the water, we flood 6 inches of water and put a mechanical machine through it that beats the vines, that knocks the berries loose, and they float to the surface. And we surround them up, corral them up as we call it, and then pump them into a truck. Today they're all sorted mechanically by, at least the water-picked ones, sorted by a machine. The separator has a series of an electric motor that runs a barrel that tumbles them around, and a fan in there that blows the leaves out and blows them around. And supposedly as they come out the other end, they're supposed to be clean. They drop down a table. You might have to be there to pull a few twigs out here and there. That's basically it. Nothing high-tech or anything. It's back to old Cape Cod, you know, back to doing things the old-fashioned way.
Cranberries are also an island thing. Nantucket boasts the world's largest cranberry bog in the middle of the island. Of course, with farms, you had a number of crafts, like carving and candle making and basket weaving, that provided the implements needed for operations in daily life. Most of these crafts have disappeared in this age of mass production. by a curious twist of fate, one of the last traditional crafts, basket making, has become a collected art out on Nantucket. And this was a craft perfected at sea. It's the lightship basket.
Really, back when they were invented, my idea is everybody needed baskets. Now, these men on the lightship, which was like a moored lighthouse, just a ship with navigational lights on it, these guys had a lot of time on their hands. And I think they brought the materials to make baskets with them anyway, but wanted to waste some time. They didn't want to spend 2 days making a basket when they could spend 2 weeks making it. They were a special thing because there was that much extra work put in them, but still were a functional item. So I think people recognized fairly soon that they were a special thing, and they moved to shoreside after that. You know, we're still made on the ships, but people would do them on the land as well, just realizing that it was a nice thing to make even their everyday items a little stronger, or a little nicer looking, that kind of thing. I feel the handbags really, because it's such a thing on Nantucket to have a handbag. For a while when there was a real estate boom on and people were selling a lot of houses, I got the idea as soon as the papers were passed, the woman had to come and buy a basket kind of to go with the house to say, I live here on the island. And I think that's done a lot to keep the whole craft and art alive.
One of the great problems of having a resort culture on the Cape and Islands is that people often forget to see tourism as part of the tradition. Most visitors to the Cape and Islands expect the ways of hospitality and resort. The endless beaches and the cool summer breezes make this one of America's favorite getaways. Tourism is the region's primary industry, and it has its own history. And it created many of the aspects of culture and traditions we see today. The area first became a place of resort as an outgrowth of the great religious revival of the mid-19th century. This was a time of intense moral fervor and spirituality that ultimately led to the Holy Crusade of the abolitionists. Thoreau on Cape Cod reports on the mass appeal of these meetings.
Eastham was famous of late years for its camp meetings, held in a grove nearby to which thousands flock from all parts of the bay. We conjectured that the reason for the perhaps unusual, if not unhealthful, development of the religious sentiment here was the fact that a large portion of the population are women whose husbands and sons are either abroad on the sea or else drowned, and there is nobody but they and the ministers left behind. There are sometimes 150 ministers and 5,000 hearers assembled. They select a time for the meeting when the moon is full. A man is appointed to clear out the pump a week beforehand while the ministers are clearing their throats. But probably the latter do not always deliver as pure a stream as the former.
Few remnants of this great religious period remain. However, out on Martha's Vineyard is one place where you can actually come to discover this important part of American history. Here is the old camp meeting ground.
It started by a group of Methodists from Edgartown in 1835 who came up for a religious revival. And they camped out here for about 6 days in tents, went back to Edgartown. In the ensuing years, from 1835 to 1850, by inviting both churches, congregations, and ministers from the mainland, it grew from 100 people to 5,000 people coming to attend a religious revival. And at one time, we had as many as 500 tents on the campground. Whole congregations or churches would come over at that time. And they pretty much stayed together and stayed in what were called society tents, which were large tents with many families staying in one tent, divided down the middle by a canvas screen with men on one side, women and children on the other. And this went along for quite a few years until they gravitated to what was called a family tent. The family tent was the forerunner of the cottages that you see here today. It was originally on a wooden platform and about the size of the square footage of a small cottage today. And by 1880, they had converted most of the 500 tents to 500 wooden cottages. Campground cottages originally were known as American Carpenter's Gothic. The Gothic being from the cathedral-type doors and windows that are on there, and the American carpenter being just the fellow who was building these down here. The tabernacle originally was a huge tent, very similar to a circus tent, with a speaker stand on the other end of it. And in 1879, they decided to build the tabernacle. Originally, they were going to build it of wood. But surprisingly enough, in 1879, the price of wood brought to the island was more expensive than to build it out of steel. Originally, I came to be here because I met my wife in Boston. Her folks, her aunts and uncles, and her grandparents all had cottages on the campground at that time. Since that time, what was her mother's cottage is now my son's cottage, which was his grandmother's cottage. So about 30% of the cottages here in the campground have been handed down from one generation to another.
Gradually, the Great Awakening dimmed. So while the revival meetings had introduced to the Cape Islands as a place for spiritual renewal, it was a renewal of a more secular sort that led to the great wave of tourism. In the latter part of the 19th century, the area around the campground in Oak Bluffs led the way, with an expansion into a resort area with its own identity based on the campgrounds. Development radiated out into what became known as Cottage City. Today it's known as Oak Bluffs. Oak Bluffs is also home to another unique tradition of tourism, perhaps because of its religious heritage.
My dad's mother was originally from Boston, and we're talking way back in the 1800s. And even though he and she grew up in Tuskegee, Alabama, it was a tradition of their family to go to the vineyard. So every summer, my grandmother and my grandfather would pack my father and his 3 brothers and sisters up, and they'd make the trek up from Tuskegee, Alabama to Martha's Vineyard. Blacks first started coming from the big cities of New York, Philadelphia, and Boston to Martha's Vineyard, and they would start to summer there renting cottages, and then as they started holding down middle-class jobs such as teachers and court stenographers and physicians and lawyers, they were able to start purchasing their own homes. And it became a place where African Americans could go and socialize, and they knew they were going to see others who were like them, others who shared the same concerns, came from the same background, wanted to improve the lives for their children. And through the generations, people kept returning because of this environment. And that's been a tradition that has been just carried on for years and years and years.
Besides the spiritual roots, the islands first developed the tourism industry in response to economic need.
After the depression that followed the demise of the whaling industry, the Industrial Revolution became a reality following the Civil War. The size and shape and kind of life in the cities reflected this change, and the cities, particularly along the East Coast, your big manufacturing cities, became very crowded, quite dirty, very unsanitary, particularly during the warm weather months of the year. And your middle and top management people who now, for the first time, had extra time on their hands. There was more leisure time, there was more money, and Nantucket Island, being here 30 miles out at sea, had a very healthy and salubrious kind of climate. The air was clean, the beaches were clean, the wind blew steadily, blowing off any miasma that might have arisen or be brought back from the mainland. And so your families began to come to Nantucket, and as the traffic increased, so also did the service businesses to accommodate these people, and more people meant that you needed more and more advertising to bring them, and the steamship line began to provide regular passenger service, and we just grew into a tourist spot. And so it's now close to 100 years that Nantucket has accounted. The economy of the island has been based primarily upon visitors.
The Four Chimneys is one of the largest wooden structures on Nantucket. And the Four Chimneys was built in 1835 by sea captain, Captain Frederick Gardner. And he, on Orange Street, where 126 sea captains built their mansions. And he also had a lumber business in town. Then there was a big fire in Nantucket, and he lost his business in town. So someone named Adams purchased it from him, and he turned it into a bed and breakfast inn. It was called the Bayview House. It was a resort kind of place in 1870. The Bayview House was one of the first homes to be converted into a guest house, and that is when the tourist trade started becoming the main source of income in Nantucket.
Martha's Vineyards, great whaling port of Edgartown, enjoyed similar benefits from the new tourist economy.
Just about the time whaling began to really fall apart, there were the tourists, and a lot of the great homes in Edgartown become immediately shift right over into inns. Even their own owners do it, because it's probably more fun to be an innkeeper than to be somebody else's first mate at the end of the whaling era. And there's almost no great house on North or South Water Street that hasn't been an inn at some point in its career, even if it isn't now.
Soon, developers were discovering the prospects of summer tourism. Grand summer hotels were built on the islands. Up at the end of Water Street is the venerable Harbor View Hotel. It's worth a moment to just sit on the rocker line front porch and get a feel for the earlier resort. As the islands developed the tourist trade, the Cape had remained largely untouched. Its economy of farms and fishing provided more stability. Tourism developed here in a different manner. Most of the rest of the Cape remained a sleepy agricultural area until towns like Provincetown and Wellfleet started to attract the artists. Well, actually, Provincetown had visitors very early on, but they don't like to talk about it much. Back when the Pilgrims were still eking out an existence in Plymouth, Provincetown was gaining notoriety as a less savory resort. At that time, the sandy curved spit at the very tip of the peninsula was the only place actually known as Cape Cod. And here in the 1630s, out along Herring Cove Beach, European fishermen and privateers, looking for a bit of relaxation, supported a collection of taverns and brothels called Helltown. This resort was so despised and ill-reputed that Provincetown was not actually made part of the formal governance of the colony until 100 years later in 1727. And even then, it remained exempt from taxation and military duty. In response to these conditions, the colonial government played a neat trick of early land use planning, which prevented the inhabitants from owning the land on which they resided. Except for a narrow strip of land along the harbor, the rest of the tip of the Cape was declared public property and called the Province Lands. Today, this area is the oldest parcel of land in America set aside purely for public good. Of course, that public good was once defined as logging and pasturage, which led to the dramatic desert-like landscape seen today. Some places seem to retain a unique attraction. The freewheeling early history of the early days of Provincetown flowed down to this century. At the turn of the century, the bohemians and artists of New York and Boston rediscovered its attractions. A leading painter of the day, Charles Hawthorne, established a painting school. Before long, P-Town was the leading artist colony in America. John Dowd is one of the resident community of fine artists that continue to make the tip of Cape Cod one of the most interesting places in all America.
When I got out of college, I just decided to come to Provincetown, come to the Cape for the summer. I just really think it's beautiful, and I really like the architecture and the sense of freedom, and it's a really good community. It's nurturing to its artists. It's a nice small town where what people do is really appreciated. There's a lot of creative types here, and not just painters, but you know, people that are doing dishwashing that happen to be writing a book that wins a Pulitzer Prize. Definitely everyone always sees Edward Hopper in my work. I won't deny that he's one of my favorites. I came out of college after studying architecture. I'm definitely interested in that he painted the architecture here in Provincetown, and that's what I'm doing, and I'm interested in light and composition. The light here, I think, has a special kind of clarity, and that may be because we're being at the very end of the Cape like this. We're surrounded on three sides by water, and they talk about it in kind of conjunction with like Greek islands, where you have the light reflecting off the sand and bouncing off the atmosphere and all of that. And it's similar here, I think. There's an awful lot of color to the light, and with the structures here being mostly painted white, you get beautiful effects of shadows. The style of the architecture here is very angular and sharp, and with the light coming in, it manifests itself in kind of some kind of a geometric background to my paintings. And I can go by a house, you know, maybe 3 or 4 times and never see it the same way, because the shift of the light here just doesn't make it pleasing for a composition that I like. But one day I'll come by and the shaft of light coming down from a dormer window will make a diagonal, which I think is remarkable. And there's plenty of places which are gorgeous, breathtaking landscapes, but there's not the intellectual fervor that goes along with a town like this, which is known for not only the painters, but the writers and playwrights, and pretty special in that aspect.
It was the images of Cape Cod that this tradition of painters has shown to the popular culture that spawned its continuing romantic appeal. By the 50s, calendars, movies, and songs like Old Cape Cod provided the popular culture with visions of quaint small villages and long romantic beaches. This translated into mass tourism marketing. During the 20s and 30s, the Cape then started to develop its own history as a resort. Hyannisport was one of the earliest towns to feel that development. Financiers and celebrities built grand homes out along the water. Here you can take the harbor cruise and view the mansions. This is where the Kennedy family maintained its famous compound. The legacy of President John F. Kennedy is palpable in Hyannis, and there is a waterfront memorial to his memory.
Hyannis is the largest village in the town of Barnstable. Not only that, it's the largest village on Cape Cod. It's almost city proportions at this moment, and it's like a melting pot. People generally aim for Hyannis on account of the Kennedys, and then they fan out from there to decide where they're going to retire or where they want to stay more often.
Falmouth, too, profited from early development. It's easy to see the wealth of the area just by cruising the Falmouth Inner Harbor. Old money never likes to show itself off. So the far town of Chatham developed a tourist economy without the publicity accorded to the flashier resorts of the Cape.
Chatham's a great place. Out toward the light and out toward the water, the estates by people of wealth who retire there, and they're helpful to the town in that the men in the town get to be estate overseers and workers. It's rather a unique economy to Chatham.
Wellfleet was another quiet town that grew as a spillover artist colony for those who didn't fit into Provincetown, and it has the art galleries to prove it. And since intellectuals and investors follow the artist, Wellfleet became a resort for those in the thinking trade. It has been joked in New York and Boston that during August, if you need to find your psychotherapist, you'll have to look on the beaches of Wellfleet. This tourism economy has had its price. Where once the songs celebrated the small towns and salty air, the current reality is often different. The towns of the Upper Cape and Islands have undergone the most changes because of the visitors. Whole stretches of former farmland are now covered with suburban development, and the moors of the islands are now punctuated with modernistic homes. The locals list the traffic as one of the worst features about the Cape.
What's happened to the Cape? It's gone to pieces. It's like every place in the world, overpopulated and not enough attention to the preserving of the environment, the real character of the place. It's getting like every place else. Just look at it, it's getting almost like Florida in population. Fact is, Cape Cod is approaching 50% retired, which has changed the economy of Cape Cod almost backwards.
The recent growth of the Cape and Islands doesn't mean they've lost their charms. It merely means that visitors may have to work a little harder to find them. There are still the quaint towns, and because of the National Seashore and Island preservations, much of the dramatic dunes and pristine beach remains. But for all the ways not so visible, everyone should listen to the voices of the people, to hear the stories of the old as they come down to us in the context of today. The Cape and Islands are still full of special moments waiting to be discovered.
We're laid back. It's not like, you know, I see it being like old-fashioned way of doing things, not like the city way where everything's moving, going this way, going that way. We're just kind of going with the flow, I guess you could say.
The magic about the vineyard depends on the person you are. For some people, it's the water, and for others, it's the history and the sense of being part of it.
This is something that I've just always wanted to do. I don't need the city or, you know, the latest movies. It's just, this is happiness for me.
Cape Cod is many things to many people, but I think to every single one of us, it is or can become a special place. Let yourself relax while you're here. Let yourself see what there is to be seen. Understand your past. Develop a sense of continuity with those who came before us. And go away taking with you memories of this very special place that will enrich your life for the rest of your time on this planet.